Imagine the air, thick with anticipation, and the scent of sawdust and summer grass. It is the mid-20th century, and under the vast canvas of a revival tent, thousands of souls hang on a single voice. The voice of Billy Graham. It rises and falls, a charismatic current pulling the crowd toward a promise of salvation. But the most enduring legacy of this era was not forged in the spotlight, but in the quiet of a California motel room. Away from the roaring crowds, a quiet decision was made among his team, a solemn pact. It was 1948 in Modesto, California, and Graham, along with his closest associates, laid down a series of personal and professional commitments designed to be a firewall against the temptations that had brought down so many other evangelists. They resolved to handle ministry finances with unimpeachable integrity, to work with all churches, to report their results honestly, and, most consequentially for our story, they made a pledge. A pledge to avoid any situation that could even appear compromising with women to whom they were not married. No private meetings, no traveling alone, no dining together. This wasn't just a personal choice. It became a foundational tenet for his ministry, a strategic and spiritual defense mechanism. This informal agreement, later codified as the Billy Graham Rule or Modesto Manifesto, was born out of a profound desire to protect the integrity of their mission from the specter of scandal. The spiritual landscape of the time was littered with the cautionary tales of charismatic leaders whose ministries had crumbled under the weight of financial impropriety or sexual misconduct. Graham and his team were acutely aware that in the burgeoning age of mass media, perception was reality. A single photograph, a whispered rumor, could undo decades of work and discredit the very message they sought to proclaim. While the rule itself is not explicitly detailed in Scripture, it draws its theological water from a deep well of biblical principles. It is an application of the Apostle Paul's exhortation to the Thessalonians to abstain from all appearance of evil. This concept goes beyond the mere avoidance of sin. It is a call to live in such a way that one's actions could never be misconstrued, to protect one's public witness at all costs. It also echoes Paul's warning to the Corinthians to flee from sexual immorality, taking a proactive, preventative stance against temptation. Theologically, this rule represents a very specific application of ascetic principles within the framework of modern American evangelicalism. It prioritizes perceived moral purity and the preservation of reputation over certain forms of unrestricted social and professional interaction. It is built upon a particular anthropology, an understanding of human nature as inherently frail and susceptible to temptation, especially in the realm of sexuality. The solution, therefore, is not to strengthen willpower alone, but to architect one's life to preemptively remove potential occasions for sin, thereby safeguarding one's witness and marriage. It is a boundary drawn not out of animosity, but out of a perceived need for protection. Protection for the individual, for their family, and for the sanctity of the ministry itself. For decades, this principle operated quietly, an internal code of conduct for a specific religious subculture. But as its adherents moved from the revival tent into the corporate boardroom, a fundamental question began to emerge. How does such a deeply ingrained spiritual discipline, a rule designed for the unique context of a traveling ministry, translate to the complex, diverse, and legally regulated demands of the modern professional world? This leads us to the historical echoes of similar boundaries, walls both visible and invisible, erected across countless other traditions, long before the first revival tent was ever pitched. Step back in time, further and further, until the hum of the modern world fades into the murmur of ancient cities. We find ourselves in 5th century Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire. Here, the Empress Pulcheria, a figure of immense political and religious power, takes a public vow of virginity. This act, while extreme, was not an anomaly. It was a powerful demonstration of a form of gendered piety that saw spiritual purity as intrinsically linked to physical separation and sexual abstinence. Now, let us journey westward to the wind-swept coasts of Ireland or the sun-drenched hills of Italy. And listen, in the profound silence of a medieval monastery, we find another kind of boundary. Here, cloistered monks and nuns lived lives deliberately and physically separated from the opposite sex. The architecture of the cloister itself, the high walls, the grills, the carefully delineated spaces, was a testament in stone and mortar to a theological conviction that spiritual focus required a radical severing of worldly ties, chief among them the complex interactions between men and women. Across the vast tapestry of global religious traditions, we find this recurring theme, the meticulous creation of boundaries to manage gender interaction. In Orthodox Judaism, the mechitza, a physical partition in the synagogue, separates men and women during prayer, a practice rooted in Talmudic interpretations of temple rituals and the need to prevent frivolity during worship. This extends into social life through the laws of Yehud, which prohibit a man and a woman who are not related or married from being secluded together. In Islam, the concept of hijab, or modesty, applies to both men and women, manifesting in veiling practices for women and injunctions for both sexes to lower their gaze, creating a zone of respectful distance. Early Christianity, too, wrestled with these questions, as seen in the Apostle Paul's writings to the Corinthian church regarding head coverings for women during worship. And the celibacy requirements for priests in the Catholic tradition represent the institutionalization of this separation at the highest levels of spiritual leadership. Even in the East, the Vinaya texts of Buddhism contain hundreds of specific rules governing the interactions between monks and laywomen, all designed to preserve the monk's vow of celibacy and prevent the arising of attachment. These practices, though diverse in their expression, are often rooted in similar theological soil. They spring from conceptions of purity and sanctity and a pervasive anxiety about the perceived spiritual dangers of uncontrolled male-female contact. Philosophically, these boundaries often reflect a dualistic worldview, one that posits a sharp distinction between the spiritual realm, seen as pure, orderly, and masculine, and the material, fleshly world, often associated with the feminine and the chaotic. These separations can serve multiple overlapping functions. They are seen as a way to protect women from unwanted advances, to preserve the spiritual focus of men dedicated to a religious path, to maintain a clear social and cosmic order, and to visibly symbolize a community's commitment to a higher, transcendent ideal. Archaeological evidence of separate entrances for men and women in ancient temples or distinct seating arrangements in synagogues further corroborates these historical divisions. However, it is impossible to examine these practices without also asking difficult questions about power, agency, and equality. When does a boundary designed for spiritual protection become a barrier to full participation? When does a theological ideal of purity inadvertently reinforce social hierarchies that limit the opportunities and influence of women? These historical precedents reveal that the Billy Graham rule is not an isolated modern invention, but a contemporary manifestation of a much larger, global, and ancient tapestry of religious boundary making. Yet, the modern, secular workplace, with its legal mandates for equality and its emphasis on integrated, collaborative teams, presents a unique and unprecedented challenge, forcing these historical patterns into direct and often uncomfortable confrontation with the values of the 21st century. The sterile, fluorescent-lit halls of a modern courthouse are a world away from the reverent silence of a cloister or the fervent energy of a revival tent. There are no stained glass windows here, only polished linoleum and the quiet, relentless hum of the HVAC system. Here, in the year 2025, a landmark lawsuit unfolds. The dispute is not over doctrine or scripture, but over something far more mundane and yet profoundly consequential, a mentorship meeting. At its heart is the practical application of a religious principle, the Billy Graham rule, within a professional, secular environment. The plaintiff, a woman, argues that her inability to meet one-on-one with her male supervisor has denied her crucial opportunities for career advancement, constituting illegal sex-based discrimination. The defendant, a man of devout faith and his organization, asserts his First Amendment right to the free exercise of his religion. The air in the courtroom crackles with the tension between these two deeply held American values, the right to religious freedom and the right to equal opportunity. The legal framework for this conflict is complex and fraught with nuance. The plaintiff's case rests heavily on Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, a cornerstone of federal law which prohibits employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. From this perspective, any policy that treats male and female employees differently, even with a non-malicious intent, can be seen as discriminatory if it creates a tangible barrier to advancement. The defendant, however, invokes the powerful protections of the First Amendment, arguing that forcing him to violate a sincerely held religious conviction represents an unconstitutional burden on his faith. The courts are then left to navigate the treacherous waters of legal precedent. Cases like the 2012 Supreme Court ruling in Hosanna Tabor Evangelical Lutheran Church and School v. EEC affirmed a broad ministerial exception, giving religious organizations significant autonomy in the hiring and firing of employees considered ministers. But the central question in our 2025 lawsuit is how far that exception extends. Does it protect a manager in a secular-facing role at a faith-based nonprofit? Does it protect a religious individual working in a completely secular corporation? The scope of this exception remains a fiercely contested legal terrain. This legal battle forces a profound philosophical debate that extends far beyond the courtroom walls. How does a pluralistic, secular society balance the rights of religious individuals and institutions to live out their faith with the imperative to ensure a level playing field for all citizens in the public square, particularly the workplace?
It challenges the very definition of reasonable accommodation. Is it reasonable to ask a company to restructure teams or mentorship programs to accommodate a religious belief, or does that create an undue hardship on the business and on other employees? Pushing us to consider whether practices intended to prevent sin inadvertently create systemic barriers to professional advancement and foster a stained glass ceiling for women. The debate is not just legal, it is a deeply ethical inquiry into the limits of religious freedom in a shared, interdependent world. It asks what happens when one person's expression of piety becomes another person's barrier to opportunity. The outcome of such cases will undoubtedly reshape the landscape for both faith-based organizations and religious employees across the country. It will draw new lines in the sand, defining the boundaries of religious practice in the American workplace for decades to come. And in doing so, it will force a difficult, necessary reevaluation of how ancient spiritual disciplines, forged in worlds of stark separation, can be adapted, or, if they can be adapted at all, to a world that increasingly demands integration, collaboration, and equality. The verdict, when it comes, will echo far beyond this one case, signaling the future of faith in the public square.